I had problems the last time, so that's great. So what we'd like to do this morning is provide an overview of the changes to the legislation. And as Dana mentioned, feel free, because you think of questions, you may forget them. So feel free to enter them into the chat pod. And Rochelle will answer questions as we go along. And then, she can recap those questions and answers at the end, as well as we can take new questions. So you have that ability to ask questions as we go, and then at the end if you prefer. So just a bit of a recap on what's happened over the last few years. It's been pretty active for OHS legislation in Alberta. In 2018, there was very extensive changes to the legislation. The first extensive changes we'd had in many, many years in Alberta to the OHS legislation. And while a number of the changes worked well, others didn't. And they addressed longstanding concerns, these changes, but people really felt that the new legislation was very prescriptive, inflexible, and it was actually quite confusing in places, people felt. The new legislation 2018 didn't allow for tailoring to individual work sites as well, and that was a complaint we received. So as such, the government engaged with Albertans in the summer of 2020 to improve OHS laws. And legislation was passed in December of 2020 that created a new OHS Act, and it was brought into force. The changes will come into force on December 1st of 2021, so very quickly coming at us. The time between passing of the legislation last December and it coming into force this December was needed to allow time to make the necessary changes to other pieces of the legislation, such as the regulation and the code, to make them work together with the amended OHS Act. There's also a multi-year OHS code review plan. Engagement was done specific to the proposed year one changes in the spring of 2021. Most of the proposed changes that came from that engagement are still being developed and approved, and therefore are separate from the changes we're discussing here today. However, changes to health and safety committee and representative requirements, and some of the changes to the radiation section of the OHS code that were part of the spring 2021 engagement will be implemented with the Act amendments on December 1st. Stakeholders demonstrate strong support for simpler laws that provide flexibility that was missing with the implementation in 2018, as well as clear definitions and processes and reduction of burdensome documentation and processes. There was also a strong desire from stakeholders, though, to maintain fundamental rights and protections for workers. We'll present an overview of the changes to the legislation, and we'll provide more detail on each piece throughout this presentation. The new OHS legislation makes requirements easier to understand and follow for Albertans while maintaining or improving health and safety outcomes. And this includes maintaining the fundamental protections and rights for workers, but also giving that greater flexibility for worksite parties to manage their own health and safety issues. Specifically, there's a number of changes, including clear definitions and removal of duplicate and redundant provisions, amended rules for dangerous work refusals, disciplinary action complaints, and potentially serious injury reporting, simplifying the requirements for health and safety committees and representatives, as well as health and safety programs, and incorporating radiation equipment laws into the OHS legislation itself. Simpler processes for acceptances and approvals and the introduction of allowances are being introduced, and greater flexibility in enforcement. While much prescription has been removed from the legislation, the purpose of the legislation remains the same and doesn't change, and there are hopefully improved outcomes. The fundamental concept of the internal responsibility system has been maintained in OHS legislation, and the internal responsibility system means that everybody at the workplace is responsible for health and safety according to their authority and control, and usually that's the employer in most cases. And that worksite parties have the necessary processes in place to manage health and safety. And the government, of course, provides that external monitoring and enforcement. Additionally, the three fundamental workers' rights, and that's the right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse dangerous work, have all been maintained. The presentation is going to focus on a few key areas where more substantial changes have been made. Resources to help guide stakeholders through the changes that are being made available, and we'll point you in the direction of those later in the presentation as we move forward. These key areas are health and safety committees and representatives, radiation equipment, dangerous work refusals, disciplinary action complaints, worksite party obligations, serious incident and injury reporting, health and safety programs, and consolidation of the OHS regulation to the OHS Act and Code. We're going to start off with a discussion around the changes in relation to health and safety committees and representatives. And health and safety committees and health and safety representatives, they're the foundation of the internal responsibility system because they provide the framework for participation in occupational health and safety. Under the new legislation, there'll be a clear delineation of requirements between the OHS Act and the OHS Code. The requirements that enable the framework for committees and representatives, as well as their high-level duties, will reside in the Act. More technical requirements for committees and representatives are moved into the OHS Code, with other technical requirements that already are situated there. Part of the overarching framework includes the requirement that employers cooperate with the committee or the representative and respond in a timely manner and ensure committees or representatives are meeting their obligations. Overall, there'll be greater flexibility for how worksites operate their committees and a simpler calculation of worker numbers for when a committee or representative is required. Many of the changes are related to moving requirements from the Act to the Code. Some of the requirements have also changed and will require employer action before December 1st to ensure that the employers are in compliance with the new legislation. An employer that regularly employs 20 or more workers is required to establish a health and safety committee. An employer who regularly employs 5 to 19 workers is required to have a health and safety representative. The new calculation will be based on the number of workers regularly employed. So that term regularly employed is important. Employers have the flexibility to determine what regularly employed means, specifically as applied to their business. For the purposes of committees and representatives thresholds, unpaid volunteers are not counted. However, volunteers are considered workers under OHS legislation with all the same rights and responsibilities. They can also participate on a committee or as a representative. They're only excluded from the count when determining if a committee or representative is required. Multiple employer work sites that don't have a prime contractor have to establish a committee when there are 20 or more workers and a representative when there are 5 to 19 workers. Under the new Act, committees or representatives are no longer mandatory for work sites that have a prime contractor. Instead, prime contractors must establish a system to ensure cooperation between workers and employers in respect to health and safety, and they have to designate a health and safety contact for that site. Individual employers on these work sites will maintain their own employer level committee or representative as required. Prime contractors will still be able to implement a health and safety committee or representative as part of their health and safety system on the site, if so desired by the prime contractor. As already mentioned, there's no changes to the committee or representative requirements at multi-employer work sites without a prime contractor. Multi-employer work sites that are not required to have a prime contractor can voluntarily designate one. It must be done in writing, and that party must take on all of the obligations of a prime contractor. The duties of the committee or representatives are the receipt, consideration, and disposition of concerns respecting the health and safety of workers, participation in the employer's hazard assessment, the making of recommendations to the employer respecting the health and safety of workers, and review of the employer's worksite inspection documentation. These duties are now less prescriptive and are focused on the internal responsibility system. Also, when an OHS officer visits a worksite with a committee or rep, they can ask the rep or any member of the committee to join them on the inspection, not just a co-chair, which was the requirement in the previous legislation. We mentioned that some of the requirements that were previously in the Act have moved to the code and overall streamlined. We'll cover what requirements are either new to the OHS code or are existing code requirements that have been modified. Committee co-chairs moves from the OHS Act with no new requirements. It's still required to have two co-chairs, one from employer reps and the other chosen by the worker reps on the committee. Quorum also moves from the OHS Act, but the requirement remains the same. So 1/2 the members of both worker and employer members are present, and at least 1/2 of those present are worker members. The requirement that committee and representative duties and training are done during normal work hours remains in the Act. The additional clarification that those are considered work time is now in the code. The only change is that wording around specific compensation has been removed, because that'll be determined by any applicable employment contract, employment law, or collective agreement that's in place at the work sites, or for the at the work sites. For special meetings of committees, those can still be convened by an OHS officer, and the meeting minutes must be kept for 2 years. It's only those special meeting minutes where there's an explicit requirement to keep them for 2 years. Committees have flexibility on how to keep meeting records for all other meetings. The ability for the representative to call a special meeting with the employer is retained, and prime contractor was removed because it's not applicable. Posting of contact information has been slightly modified from the current OHS Act. The new requirement is that a record of the committee members or representative and their contact information is kept by the employer. What must be posted is a way to contact the committee or representative so workers know how to bring health and safety concerns forward. And this provides flexibility for the committee or the rep to decide what contact information is best to be posted. For committee membership selection, the employer chooses the number of worker representatives required for the committee to ensure that relevant occupational health and safety concerns are addressed, and there's equitable representation of unionized and non-unionized worker representatives on the committee. Non-unionized workers choose the non-unionized worker representatives. The relevant union chooses the unionized work representatives, and the employer chooses employer representatives. If no names are put forward by non-unionized workers or the union in a reasonable time specified by the employer, then the employer can appoint the worker representatives. This process for health and safety committee membership selection ensures equitable representation as well as a fair and efficient selection process. The current terms of reference requirements in the code are amended to facilitate the outcomes-based approach of the new OHS Act, provide clarity to stakeholders on how a health and safety committee will operate. The new terms of reference requirements are outlining the process for selecting co-chairs, selecting worker members to the committee to ensure worker members are representative of the workers for that employer, and the process for conducting meetings and forwarding health and safety concerns to the attention of the employer. Also, replacing a member during the member's term of office is laid out. Dispute resolution for when the committee cannot agree on a recommendation to the employer, and addressing circumstances where committee members are not fulfilling their duties. The terms of reference must also cover establishing a term of office for committee members, outlining the frequency for regular committee meetings and how meeting records will be maintained. So many of these terms of reference items are modifications from prescriptive requirements to more flexible outcomes-based requirements. Only the processes to address circumstances where committee members are not fulfilling their duties is a brand new requirement. Currently, training requirements for health and safety committees and representatives are spread throughout the OHS Act regulation and code. And these are being consolidated in section 201 of the code. Employers have to ensure that all committee members are trained, not just the co-chairs or the representative. However, the requirements for training by a designated training organization and mandatory training curriculum have been removed. The employer can now determine the appropriate level and type of training and choose their own training provider, or they can conduct in-house training, as long as the training covers 3 areas: the roles and responsibilities of co-chairs and members on joint health and safety committees and health and safety representatives, if applicable, the obligations of worksite parties, and the rights of workers. Some health and safety committee and rep requirements are being removed from the legislation. Worksite inspections under additional duties has been repealed because worksite inspections are no longer a committee or representative duty under the new OHS Act. The disclosure of personal information requirement, it contained provisions that duplicate requirements under other privacy laws, and they're removed. The last 2 in the list on the slide are not requirements that are gone completely. They were removed because they're covered by requirements under the new OHS Act. Duties of employers, contractors, and prime contractors are mostly covered under the general obligations in the OHS Act. Inspection of a work site with an officer is not required in the code, as Section 15 of the new OHS Act provides the ability for an officer to request any member of the committee or the representative to accompany them. I'm going to shift gears and start to talk about radiation equipment, which previously resided under the Radiation Health Act and its regulations. It'll be added to the OHS legislation. One thing to note is that radiation has always been a hazard and has always been covered under OHS general duties. The moved provisions address the registration inspections, and operation of certain types of radiation equipment, such as X-rays and lasers. The Radiation Protection Act and its regulations have been incorporated into the OHS Act and Code to provide alignment and clarity regarding health and safety requirements. Changes are only administrative ones, such as removing duplication and aligning with the OHS Act, and transferring enforcement from third-party agencies to OHS officers. There's no changes to how the program is carried out. Radiation equipment will still require inspection by an authorized radiation health inspection agency and registration with an authorized radiation health registration agency. OHS enforcement tools such as administrative penalties will now apply to contraventions related to radiation, and radiation overexposure is now an OHS reportable incident. The next slides will cover dangerous work refusals. The right to refuse dangerous work, of course, is a fundamental right of workers, and this has been maintained in the new OHS Act. However, a number of changes have been made in the new OHS Act. A worker may refuse work if they have reasonable grounds to believe there is an undue hazard. An undue hazard is a hazard that poses a serious and immediate threat to the health and safety of a person. Employers have to notify the Health and Safety Committee or representative of the refusal as soon as possible. There's no formal requirement for the Health and Safety Committee or representative to be a part of the inspection. However, the employer requirement to cooperate with the committee or representative and respond to recommendations in a timely manner applies in work refusals as well. The employer must discuss the matter with the refusing worker, then inspect the alleged undue hazard and take measures to remedy the hazard if one exists. As before, workers may refuse dangerous work. There's also now a requirement that where possible, the worker's refusal doesn't endanger the health and safety of others. And the example I always give is if I'm a worker and I've been asked to work in a trench, and I believe that the trench is unsafe. If I'm going to leave that trench, I should make sure that I put some kind of signage up or barricades where no other worker can enter and endanger themselves in that trench. After conducting the inspection, the employer must complete a work refusal inspection report and provide a copy to the refusing worker and the Health and Safety Committee or the rep, if there is one. After the employer's action to remedy the undue hazard, if the worker still believes the hazard exists, they can continue to have the right to notify an OHS officer who will investigate and provide their findings to the worker, the employer, and the Health and Safety Committee or representative. To reduce confusion with human rights laws, discriminatory action complaints are being renamed disciplinary action complaints. And for folks who've been around long enough, like I have, they may remember that prior to 2018, that language existed. It was disciplinary action complaints. So we're going back to that older terminology. A 180 calendar day time limit to make a complaint has been introduced to ensure a timelier resolution to these disputes. Workers under collective agreement will be required to resolve the dispute under their agreement. This elimination of complaints will stop them from being raised, elimination of complaints being redundant, as they will no longer be raised through multiple sources and forums at the work site. And it allows those who know the workplace best to resolve the concerns more comprehensively. Also, officers will have the authority to dismiss a complaint prior to investigation if the complaint is without merit, frivolous, vexatious, trivial, or made in bad faith. However, that's going to happen in very limited circumstances and can be reviewed by a director on request if it is dismissed. The fundamental protection against disciplinary action is maintained. There used to be a list of 9 protected activities, but these essentially amounted to the worker complying with OHS legislation. So that's been simplified in the legislation. The reverse onus provision has been maintained in the legislation. The remedies that an officer may employ remain the same, with the additional requirement for OHS to deduct wages earned elsewhere from any compensation award. We're going to focus specifically on prime contractor obligations, and then we'll cover the other worksite party obligations together. Prime contractors are required on work sites with 2 or more employers in the construction, oil, and gas industries. A director can also require that a work site or a class of work sites have a prime contractor. This isn't a change from the current requirements. However, we heard from stakeholders outside of construction and oil and gas that the ability to designate a prime contractor would benefit their work as well. So as such, prime contractor requirements have been amended to allow the person in control of the work site to voluntarily designate in writing a prime contractor to take on prime contractor responsibilities. The prime contractor obligations are less prescriptive, and now 2 performance or outcome-based measures are in place to establish a reasonable system to ensure compliance, and the prime must conduct its own activities in a healthy and safe manner. The requirement for a health and safety committee or representative on a site with a prime contractor has been removed. Now the prime contractor must establish a system or process to ensure cooperation between employers and workers in relation to health and safety, and as mentioned, designate a person in writing to implement the health and safety system and facilitate cooperation on the work site. If a prime contractor wants to keep their existing health and safety committee that can form part of the system they set up for the work site, they can do so. Most worksite party obligations remain the same. However, some areas were identified where changes might streamline and promote clarity. For example, information sharing requirements have been moved to worksite party obligations, and they're no longer in a separate section. Additionally, redundant provisions such as the requirement to comply with legislation have been removed. And since we're focusing on the changes to the legislation, these slides contain only the new or updated obligations, not all worksite party obligations. The changes to employer obligations are self-employed persons have been incorporated into the definition of employers with necessary modifications to their worker and employer obligations. This is the same modification that exists for self-employed persons in the current legislation. Also, moving from the OHS regulation to the Act is the requirement that an employer must ensure that work that may endanger a worker is being performed by a competent worker, or the worker is under the direct supervision of a worker competent to do the work. Also, the employer now has a requirement to ensure that the Health and Safety Committee or REP is complying with requirements imposed on them. And this provides a mechanism for enforcement should the committee or the REP not be meeting its duties under the OHS Act. The requirement for employers to resolve health and safety concerns raised by health and safety committees or representatives and workers in a timely manner has been maintained. The supervisor obligations didn't have major additions, just some wording changes for clarity and removing redundant requirements. The competency requirement was removed, as ensuring competency of supervisors is an employer obligation. The requirement for PPE has also been removed, as it's addressed in other OHS code responsibility requirements and the general duty to ensure that the supervisor's workers comply with OHS legislation. Worker obligations remain the same, with just some moving of requirements from the regulation into the Act. The two worker obligations that moved from the regulation are to participate in any training provided by the employer, and for work that may endanger a worker or others, and the worker is not competent to perform it, only be under the direct supervision of another worker who is competent. Supplier obligations have been made clearer by explicitly adding PPE to their obligations, and also by making it clear that harmful substances and explosive must also be supplied with manufacturer specifications and instructions. Service provider obligations is only a small wording change from near the work site to in the vicinity, but this isn't a change in the requirement. Contractor has been changed to contracting employer to better reflect the meaning and reduce confusion. For the purposes of the legislation, contracting employer means a person, partnership, or group of persons who through a contract, an agreement, or ownership directs the activities of one or more employers involved in work at a work site. A contracting employer who directs the activities of other employers at a work site has to ensure that other employers are complying with the OHS legislation. They must also ensure that existing or potential worksite hazards are communicated to the other worksite parties. The owner obligations to communicate hazards to all those conducting work activities in relation to the land, infrastructure, and any building or premises on the land has been moved into the general obligations in the Act. An important change which created a gap in the current OHS Act is that the land or premises do not need to be in control of the owner. In the new OHS Act, these obligations must be met by the owner or delegated appropriately. Temporary staffing agency obligations have stayed the same. If a person has multiple functions under the OHS Act, the requirement for them to fulfill multiple worksite party obligations is maintained in the new Act. The next two slides discuss the changes to reporting serious injuries and incidents, as well as to potentially serious incidents, or PSIs as they're called. The changes have added clarity to both what constitutes a reportable incident and what is a potentially serious incident, or PSI. The reporting of serious incidents has been made clear by adding illness, and this isn't a functional change in approach. The reporting has also been made clear by adding where there is reason to believe a worker has or will be hospitalized. And if you remember, in the changes that were made in 2018, it said a worker admitted to hospital. And that was hard to determine by employers a lot of the time, whether a worker had been actually admitted or not. So now the reporting is made clear by adding where the person where there's reason to believe a worker has or will be hospitalized. As a part of the incorporation of the Radiation Protection Act, exposure to radiation in excess of the limits in the OHS code has also been added under this section as a reportable incident. All other reportable incidents remain the same, though the list of mine and mine site reportables have been moved to section 544 sub 1 in the OHS code. The current process for all serious incident reporting is to call the contact center. Now, OHS is implementing a new process for certain reportable incidents where no injury or illness occurred. For serious incidents involving a fire, flood, or a derrick, crane, hoist, or structural collapse without injury or illness, starting December 1st, these will now be reported through our online portal. These are serious incidents that are outlined in the OHS Act in section 33(2) C through E, and again, only if there are no injuries or illness. The portal provides more flexibility for reporting as well as improves data collection, and it's a better use of OHS resources. This change isn't related to the legislation changes, but it's being implemented at the same time. The process for reporting a PSI has been made clearer by including more explanation of what actually constitutes a PSI. So a PSI is an incident that had a likelihood of causing a serious injury or illness, and there is reasonable cause to believe that corrective action may need to be taken to prevent reoccurrence. Now, with the changes, there's no initial report of a PSI to OHS required. Under the previous legislation, it had to be reported immediately. So no initial report of a PSI to OHS is required. As with all other reportables, the prime contractor, or if there's no prime contractor, the employer shall conduct an investigation and provide the report to OHS and a health and safety committee or rep, whichever exists. So to be clear, PSIs are still required to be reported to OHS when the investigation is complete. The information collected from PSI reports will be used primarily for information and education purposes by OHS. The information will only be used for enforcement in exceptional circumstances where a serious uncontrolled hazard still exists at a workplace. And OHS will still write orders where there is a failure to report PSIs within a reasonable time frame. And PSI reports will allow the department to better inform education and prevention initiatives. And already we're finding very valuable the trends we're able to point out when we're tracking PSIs. Admittedly, there's still a large number of employers in the province who aren't reporting their PSIs. That need to do that under legislation hasn't really caught up with many employers. And that's a matter of time. We're out there, we're enforcing the reporting of PSIs, and we're getting the message out to employers in the province that's necessary. And some of our certifying partners that are larger and have a larger number of PSIs being reported, we've entered into agreements with them to share more information, not personal information, but trending information around PSIs that allows them to start to tailor their training and things like that and focus their resources around where they're seeing most trends of these potentially serious incidents happening for their industry sectors. OHS programs and management systems are tools for improving the health and safety of workers, and they provide guidelines and practices to employers to help manage occupational health and safety. An employer who regularly employs 20 or more workers is required to establish a health and safety program. and implement the program. Volunteers are counted for the health and safety program threshold. Requirements for health and safety programs in the new Act are streamlined and made more flexible by removing specific program elements. There are many health and safety management systems an employer can use, and this provides the flexibility to choose one that works best for their workplace and their sites. Now, as an example, an employer that has a compliant health and safety management system under their certificate of recognition program, they'll meet this requirement. It's important to note, though, however, that core holders may also have to provide evidence of a functioning system to an officer if they visit the site. They don't get a pass by having that core, but they will be complying with what's required in a health and safety program. And we always remind people, holding a core doesn't guarantee compliance with the legislation. It's a systems approach. It makes sure you have the systems, and if it's just a book on the shelf, it's not going to be very effective. So it has to be an implemented and active and functioning health and safety program. In order to streamline the legislation and reduce duplication, considerable consolidation of the regulation into the Act and the Code were done. Several parts of the regulation moved into the Act or were a duplication of requirements already in the Act and have been removed from the regulation. The definition of hazardous occupation and hazardous work site moved to the Act. The new Act allows the Director of Medical Services to designate notifiable diseases, so those can be removed from the regulation. General protection of workers is covered by the employer obligations in the Act. Under duties of workers, the competency requirement for dangerous work and reporting unsafe work are covered by the worker obligations in the Act. Health and safety training is covered by employer obligations in the Act with less prescription. There are additional specific training requirements related to harmful substances and other work activities and hazards in the OHS Code. The new Act gives the minister the ability to impose any terms and conditions on designated organizations, so it'll be removed from the regulation. Other parts of the regulation have been moved to the Code or were already covered by Code requirements. Availability of specifications and equipment requirements in the regulation are moving to the Code. Under general protection of workers, the health and safety procedures development and training requirements related to harmful substances are amalgamated with Section 21 of the new OHS Code. Joint First Aid Training Standards Board, blasting operations, and mining personnel qualifications in the regulation are all being moved to the Code. Some parts of the regulation are being repealed because they're redundant, or they're being removed for other reasons. Board of Examiners for mining was dissolved in 2020, so those requirements aren't needed. The mandatory curriculum for health and safety committees and representative training curriculum is being removed. All health and safety committee training is covered under Section 201 of the new code. Since there are no approvals specific to health and safety committees or representatives, this section has been removed from the regulation. Approvals are now only covered in the new OHS Act. Other minor changes include things that are not required in law or were out of date. As an example, the requirement in Section 7 sub 3 of the regulation to keep original copies of specifications is outdated, because what you see now is so many documents are kept only electronically. What is retained in the regulation are necessary definitions, clarification that regularly employed workers does not include unpaid volunteers for the purposes of health and safety committees and health and safety rep counts only, and research and education programs and surveillance programs remain in the regulation. So there's not much, before I move on to overview of other changes, really the regulation is incredibly shrunk down, and that matches more of what you see in other jurisdictions across Canada. Although we didn't have time to cover all of the changes, we did want to point out some of the other changes and let you know that information on these is either already available on our website or it's going to be posted very soon. In the OHS Act changes, the new OHS Act simplifies processes for acceptances and approvals, so these requests can be processed more quickly. Allowances are new to legislation. Allowances, they provide flexibility when it's clear that requirements lag behind advances in technology and processes, or there are exceptional circumstances that require variance from legislation. The requirements for notices and determining the dollar amount of administrative penalties has been consolidated in the Act. The administrative penalty regulation is being repealed. The director review mechanism has been removed from legislation. Directors, however, have a general ability to vary or rescind an order or administrative penalty if an error within the order or administrative penalty is found. If a worksite party disagrees with an order or administrative penalty, they can always appeal that to the Alberta Labor Relations Board. The board hears appeals of OHS orders, administrative penalties, license cancellations or suspensions, work refusal investigations, and discriminatory action complaint decisions. The board will have the ability to remit matters back to OHS where appropriate. So there are certain circumstances where something goes to the board and they go, you know what, OHS can handle this. This doesn't need to come to us, and they can revert that back to OHS. For the code, there are a number of administrative changes, including accommodating the new definition for personal protective equipment from the Act, and ensuring that the relevant requirements throughout the code include reference to PPE separate from equipment. And this makes it clear that the requirements for equipment, pardon me, also apply to PPE. The different types of statutory directors have been removed in the Act, and they all will be referred to as director throughout the legislation. The one exception is the Director of Medical Services. The term worksite's been removed from the Joint Health and Safety Committee title. A number of changes were made to fix spelling and grammar and ensure that the language is gender neutral. The current definition of farming and ranching moves from the Farming and Ranching Exemption Regulation to a new section of the OHS Code. The move doesn't change the definition of farming and ranching and what is or isn't considered a farming and ranching operation. Sections have also been added to the code to specify that Health and Safety Committee and representative requirements in the code will apply to farms and ranches with a modification of the training requirement. For farms and ranches with a committee, only the co-chairs are required to be trained. And this isn't a change in requirements for farms and ranches, as they are subject to Health and Safety Committee and rep requirements in the OHS Act. Farms and ranches aren't subject to any other requirements in the code. For domestic workers, they were not previously subject to any of the OHS code requirements. However, some of the requirements they were subject to in the regulation have moved to the OHS code. A section's been added to the new OHS code to specify which sections of the OHS code they will now be subject to. This isn't a change in requirements for domestic workers. A number of other pieces of legislation will be repealed with these changes as the necessary requirements have been consolidated in other OHS legislation and they're no longer needed. And this includes the Administrative Penalty Regulation, the Farming and Ranching Exemption Regulation, Radiation Protection Act, Radiation Protection Regulation, and Radiation Health Administration Regulation. So I'm going to just cover a few pieces here where we are currently providing this presentation to external stakeholders, including health and safety associations and certified partners and industry associations and other safety groups, as well as large employers and other government ministries. So if there's any groups that you're involved with and you feel that they would benefit from a presentation, we'd be happy to provide one. And those requests for presentations can be made through our OHS Contact Center. We're in the process of updating over 50 publications and creating several new ones to cover the changes in the legislation. And in order to make it clear which publications contain information specific to the legislation before it's in force, and the information related to the current legislation, so making that distinction, the new publications are being posted on a separate section within the OHS resource portal. And it's called Upcoming Legislation Changes. So that's where to look for those. Once they are approved, they'll be there once they're approved. We'll put the link to that section of the OHS resource portal in the chat, and we'll provide that to Dana as well if people are looking for that link. Once the new legislation is in force, they'll be moved to the main section of the resource portal, and the then outdated publications will be removed. So everything will be in one spot for people to look. This slide just outlines some of the areas where organizations may have to do some preparation before December 1st if they want to be in compliance with the new legislation. It's not meant to be a comprehensive to-do list for every organization, and each organization's going to have to take a look at the changes to the legislation to determine which require changes for your organization. Many organizations are going to have to update the terms of reference for their health and safety committee. They're going to have to ensure all committee members are trained, not just the co-chairs. It's best to review the number of regularly employed workers you have, keeping in mind that the count does not include unpaid volunteers for the determination of health and safety committee or health and safety representative thresholds, but does include volunteers when determining if you need a health and safety program. Prime contractors need to set up a system or process to ensure cooperation between employers and workers with respect to health and safety. And they have to designate that person in writing who's going to be responsible for implementing that system or process. And just as a reminder, if a prime contractor can keep an existing committee, they can keep an existing committee at the worksite as part of their system or process, but it's not a mandatory requirement. Employers may want to review their incident reporting processes to ensure that appropriate reporting of PSIs and non-injury incidents to OHS is captured. Worksite parties should ensure that the requirements that pertain to equipment are also met by PPE on their site. So, having good specifications for PPE and making sure PPE is in good repair. Additional information on changes are available at alberta.ca, or you can email or phone the OHS Contact Center. And updated OHS Act Regulation and Code are available as PDFs from the Queen's printer. And Rochelle, some limited copies of the actual legislation is now available. Am I correct? I was saying it's going to be available last week. I think it is actually available now.
Not quite yet.
Okay.
But if you keep checking the Queen's Printer website, as soon as they have ones available for order, they will open that up. So
it's soon, very soon. Since they aren't what I was mentioning before, those PDFs, since they're not the version that is currently in force, they're not easy to find. So again, we'll put a link in the chat to those PDFs. But please note that the regulation and code are not formatted as legislation yet. So they're going to look a bit different, but the content is all there and it's correct. And that concludes our presentation. So I'll turn things over to Dana, and I'll quit sharing my screen here. I'll turn things over to Dana, and if we like, we can go through some of the questions that Rochelle received and then open the floor to more questions. Thanks, Dana.
Sure. Thanks very much, Rob. And there was some really good questions coming through the chat box. So Rochelle, maybe while we're waiting for any new questions to come through from the group, did you want to provide a quick summary of the questions that have been answered so far?
You bet. So one of the questions was if we were going to share slides, and we'll send a PDF of the slides to Dana so she can circulate those to everyone. There was a question about if there's any changes to workplace harassment, and besides administrative changes, so updating references to OHS Act sections, fixing spelling, things like that. There's no changes to the violence and harassment provisions in the OHS legislation that are coming into force on December. So we do not cover any violence and harassment in this presentation. There was questions about worksite inspections. So what is changing with health and safety committees is that they no longer will have a duty to complete the inspection. Their duty will shift to reviewing the inspection documentation. And actually this question came up in the last presentation, and I started looking to see if that means worksite inspections are still required under our legislation. I've sent the question over to legal. So I gave a bit of an answer that I'm not 100% confident in, but I do believe with the changes in the OHS program requirements, there's no explicit requirement to do general worksite inspections. However, what is required is for employers who have 20 or more workers to have a health and safety program, and almost every single health and safety program would contain general worksite inspections. So, but there was no prescribed frequency in the OHS legislation about how often you have to do them, and things like that. So I will get that confirmed, and I know I'm sending the list of questions over to Dana as well. So if there's a change in what I provided here, we'll make sure that that gets out to everyone, but I'm fairly certain that that will be the situation come December 1st, that there will be no prescribed requirement in the OHS legislation for worksite inspections, but they would be covered under health and safety programs or as a control under your hazard assessment. And there are required inspections for certain aspects like PPE, cranes, hoists, and a whole plethora of things have very specific requirements about inspecting those items. So very good question, and one that has come up a couple times. So I'm making sure that I have the right answer for it. One of the questions that just came in and I didn't have a chance to answer was, what exact training do health and safety committees members and co-chairs require? So again, there's a lot of flexibility in the training requirements now. Basically, it's summed up by section 201 of the OHS code, which is that members of the committee and the representative are trained in those 3 topics. So the roles and responsibilities of co-chairs and members on the committee and the health and safety rep, the obligations of worksite parties, and the rights of workers. And however that training is delivered is fine. And it's up to the employer to decide. And I know that Rob has also mentioned that you can continue to use the training offered by your certifying partner, by your health and safety associations. That training is still totally valid, and it's going to be good training, but there's just some flexibility there. I know a question that came up last time was about, is it still 16 hours? And no, it's just the training has to cover those 3 topics. And the shift is that all members have to be trained now, not just the co-chairs.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Rochelle. I know as legislation moves from prescriptive to more performance-based, it's often most confusing for medium to smaller employers. And those employers, they may not have the funding to have a full-blown health and safety group within their organization. And we often, when officers go out, they often say to an officer, well, just tell me what I have to do. And so as we move to this more flexible legislation, again, my message, as Rochelle said, is go to your health and safety association, go to your certifying partner. They will have recognized training. There's a lot of people out there that offer different things, but not necessarily what they offer is recognized and fulsome. So again, you're safe. If you go to your association, you go to your certifying partner, you're going to get what you need. So that's my ongoing message there.
Great, thanks, Rob. So another question was, is there still a requirement for an agreement between the employer and the unions for the Health and Safety Committee? So in the establishment of the Health and Safety Committee, which is 13.1 of the new act, it says that that they will consult with the union before establishing the committee, and that the employer decides how many worker reps are required for fair and or for equitable representation. So they will communicate that to the union about how many reps will be from the unionized workers, and then the union selects those members and gets to decide how those members are selected for the committee. The employer can tell them how much time they have to provide that worker rep name. So that's sort of how, so there's still that requirement to discuss, to consult with the union before establishing the committee, let them know how many worker reps, unionized worker reps will be on the committee, and then allow the union to select the worker rep. The link to order the handbooks with the Act Regulation Code all in one. So they don't have any of those available quite yet. And so if I give you the link, it's going to be to the old handbook. So I don't want to do that. But just continue to check the Queen's Printer website. And the book with all of it in one is called the handbook. And it's the sort of the blue book that our officers also like to use. So they are not quite available yet, but just keep an eye out for those. And I think that they are expecting to have limited quantity soon, and then more, sort of come January.
But one thing we're also working on that I've been mentioning in presentations is searchable legislation. So that's something we're hopeful at some point in December that will be up and available. So you'll be able to go in, it'll be on and you can pull it up on, it's not an app, but you should be able to access it on a cell phone and laptop or whatever, and pull it up and search the legislation electronically, where it's costing more than we thought. But one of the things that we're building into it as well is the ability to have links to publications and bulletins and things like that. So once it's all up and done, it should be pretty slick. You can go in there, and if you're looking at confined space, for example, there'll be a link to perhaps a bulletin or a publication around confined space that you can go to from that piece of legislation.
And that leads into a very great segue into another question that I just got, was about the handy guide, which I'm assuming means the explanation guide. So the explanation guide is being archived, I can't think of the right word, sorry. We're not updating the explanation guide any further because we're replacing it with the searchable legislation. So you can still buy the explanation guide, but with the caveat that it has not been updated for this latest round of changes to the OHS code. And so it's getting a little bit out of date. And that's because we're transitioning, that's what I was saying, for transitioning over to the searchable legislation. And so as Rob mentioned, sort of step one is having the searchable legislation there. And ultimately what we will be able to provide is as links to the resources. And so that's what is also available right now, is there's resources in that online resource portal, and you can search by, keyword and things like that. So we're providing more shorter, topic specific resources in the portal instead of updating the explanation guide.
And one thing we're going to do to try and keep, one thing we're going to do to try and keep on top of change as well is our contact center, they provide us with, and our Ask an Expert, they provide us with trends they're seeing in questions about legislation, so on. So after we've done all this, if we see there's one piece of the legislation where we're getting a whole bunch of questions, then we'll develop a publication around that and link it into the legislation. So it's going to give us that ability too.
Okay, I see a question about employer versus worksite-based health and safety committees. So health and safety committees will be employer-based. So if you have multiple work sites, you do not have to have a committee for each work site. You have to have an employer-based health and safety committee. The exception to that is if you are part of a multi-employer work site that does not have a prime contractor, that site is required to have a site-specific health and safety committee. So hopefully that clarifies that. The link to the act says assented to December 9th, 2020. Yes, that is the new legislation. So with the OHS Act, that bill ensuring safety and cutting red tape was passed on December 9th. And so that created the new OHS Act. And then the past year has been working on the alignment amendments to the code and the regulation. So yes, the act was actually passed quite a while ago and has been available for quite a while. And then it's just the code and the regulation piece that are sort of newer information.
Thanks very much, Rochelle. And we'll just give everybody a couple more minutes to ask any lingering questions you might have before we log off for the day. Just a quick reminder to please complete the survey that you'll be automatically triggered with once you leave the meeting, and as that will help us to continually improve the OHS member discussion forums and provide us with topics that you might want presentations on in the future. One more question has come through, Rochelle. Timely manner, is it still 30 days for the employer to respond to concerns?
So the prescribed duration for timely manner has been removed. So it still says timely manner, but we realized that depending on what the concern is or what how the employer is going to respond to the concern, might take longer than 30 days. So if it's if there's a lot of different unions and things like that at the work site, it can take longer than 30 days. So we just said it timely manner. Being responsive is important, and that's one of the things that our OHS officers will be looking for is, were you responsive? Were you working on it? But no prescribed 30 days anymore, because we realize that, there's just a huge variability in the types of concerns that can be brought forward. And same with the selecting of the worker members on the committee. The employer can say, this is the reasonable time frame, and we haven't said it must be, we haven't prescribed what a reasonable time frame is, because we realize that depending on the number of unions and those things, a reasonable time frame may look different on different work sites, but it must be reasonable. So, I think Rob had used the example before that, like, if the employer gave 1 day and then they just started appointing people, that would not be a reasonable time frame. So some flexibility in there for the worksite parties to come to an agreement about what timely means for them. How often is a OHS officer inspecting a worksite only if a complaint is made? This is a really great question. We had it last time too. So there's no prescribed frequency that an OHS officer will come to inspect your worksite. An inspection is triggered by some different things. Rob did a great job of answering this question at the last one. So Rob, I will attempt to recreate your answer, and then you can hop in if I forget anything. So inspections are triggered by a couple different things. The planned ones can be by having like a certain proactive inspection program or a focus inspection program where, we're targeting or looking at a specific hazard or things like that, or we're going out to certain industries and things like that. But even within that, we'd only get to a selection of all of the worksites in Alberta within that program. If a complaint is made, definitely that will trigger an inspection. If there's an immediate danger called into the OHS contact center, then an officer will come out. If you have an incident and there is an investigation, then often what will happen is there'll be a follow-up general inspection of your worksite. So I think those are all of the things that would trigger an inspection. And one of the things that we had said is that COVID has actually meant that our officers are going out to a lot of work sites that we had not necessarily interacted with before. So, we've been going out to daycares and schools and continuing care facilities and things like that, like things where there hadn't been, a lot of reason or need for OHS officers to go to. So you may have seen us at some work sites that we had not been to before COVID. So the question of regularly employed. So this was left very flexible because exactly of the issue that is in the question about sometimes your number goes up and down day to day. And so the idea is with regularly employed is sort of what is your regular, what is normal operations, and for you to determine what regularly employed looks like for your operation. So we are not going to come out and say, it means, count all your full-time and part-time workers and they all count as one, or 90 days or less. So the flexibility is given to each employer to look at their operations and determine what regularly employed means for you. And if you think that you're normally over 20 workers, then you should establish a committee. And if you're not, then a health and safety rep would be required. 5 to 19 regularly employed workers, a rep would be required.
Okay, are there any outstanding questions? You can also feel free to unmute and start your video if you'd like to ask a question that way. just give it another minute or so. Just as a FYI to everybody, the links that Rochelle has provided in the chat, we've already made available on CCSA's website. So on our homepage, we have an announcement about the December 1st legislation that's coming into force. And then within that announcement are all of the links that Rochelle's already provided. And we'll continue to update those as new information becomes available. Doesn't look like we're getting any more questions coming through. So I think we'll wrap up today's session. Thanks again, Rob and Rochelle, for joining us once again today. And really appreciate you sharing the information with CCSA members. As Rochelle said, we will be sharing a PDF copy of all of the slides to today's session to all attendees by email shortly after the session today. We've also recorded the session, so we'll be making that available via YouTube. And very shortly, we'll be providing a kind of a synopsis of what's most important for continuing care to know about the upcoming changes, and that will be available to our members as well in the very near future. How can I get a recording of today, as I missed the portion due to other tasks coming on? Oh, thanks, Jane, for that question. It will be available on CCSA's YouTube site. So we will announce that on our website as soon as it's available. But that's where you'll find it, is on CCSA's YouTube site. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks again, Rob and Rochelle. Thanks everyone for participating. Please take a moment to answer the survey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.